good? Yeah, so I called this the closing prayer, and this morning they were like, oh man, I feel bad for whoever has the closing prayer. It's not like that, I promise. No, we're going to be talking a little bit over these next just couple weeks about John chapter 17. And if you're not familiar with this, over the next few weeks you will become familiar with it. But what it is kind of Jesus's last prayer. And one of the reasons I wanted to get into this topic was, to me, it felt like a real natural progression of what we had just finished, John and I, looking at those I am statements throughout the book of John. And the reason this kind of comes to that natural end is throughout those statements as they're made, the audience gets more and more personal each time. So when those first I am statements are made, he's talking to larger groups of just whoever's around. He's speaking like in the temple court. And then the statements get a little more focused and they start talking to a specific group of the Pharisees, and they're kind of tough and condemning there. And then right at the end, his statements are really just the apostles that were with him in that upper room. And that conversation gets more and more focused, but here we put those aside and his conversation is really just between him and the Father. And so it gets to be very intimate that way. It also is, from a scriptural perspective, something you could get lost in for a very long time. There is so much that he says, and when somebody is really in effect on their deathbed, that is, where likely the most of what was important to you and what's on your heart is going to come out, and we absolutely see that happen here. And it is super remarkable that way. Now, the chapter and his prayer really has three kind of very clear chunks to it. Better switch. There we go. It starts with Jesus praying to the Father about himself. So really praying for himself. In a middle chunk, he prays specifically for those disciples that are actually there with him. And then at the end, he very directly and very purposely says a prayer for all of us. And so we're going to take a couple of weeks and really look through each one of those prayers and those segments and those meanings as they come along. This, to me, also feels like the best example of prayer and really a prayer from Jesus. Now, I know that we have the Lord's Prayer, which is covered in Matthew chapter 6, which is the Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. That was really meant as a teaching point for us on how we should pray, but not necessarily the way Jesus himself is going to pray. And the reason I know that is because it says something very clearly of forgive us as we forgive those who trespass us. Not Jesus' need. He had no need for forgiveness. And so that's a good instruction for us, but not necessarily how Jesus himself needed to pray. But this is our best example of it. And the thing that I love the most is that it really developed an idea of what prayer can look like. And throughout the Gospels, we hear reference of Jesus went to pray. He went to pray alone. He was spending time in prayer. But we don't get a lot of, all right, what did that consist of? Like, what was the context of that? But here we get a beautiful moment where we get to eavesdrop a little bit. And we're going to be looking at that. And now, today we're just going to be focusing on the first prayer of Jesus praying for himself and some of the really incredible content that is included there. But to set the scene, because I think that's important, we need to kind of know what what brought Jesus to this instance, and that's actually seen in the preceding couple of chapters. So the way the book of John is written is it has, much of Jesus's ministry covered in like the first 11 chapters, and then right at the end we start to see like the last moments of his life, the last week really. And in chapters 13 and 14 and 15 and 16, we're going to see a very intense conversation that he has with those disciples. There were moments that were very distressing for them. So he's telling them, guys, I'm going away. I'm leaving. And that was very hard for them to hear. And he said, but don't worry, I'm going to send you an advocate afterwards, but I have to leave. And so they're under this mixed emotion moment of hearing he's leaving and somehow thinking it's going to be okay, but probably not really thinking it's going to be okay. And it was a very mixed bag of emotions. But we get to see kind of the last little bit that brings us in. So if you turned to John chapter 17, when I asked you to, let's go back one chapter. We're going to look at just the last little bit of chapter 16 and some of what Jesus says to them that is both distressing and encouraging at the same time. And I'm going to start in verse 25. So chapter 16, verse 25. Though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use this kind of language, but I will tell you plainly about my Father. In that day you will ask in my name. I'm not saying that I will ask the Father on your behalf. No, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I come from God. I came from the Father and entered the world, and now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father. Then Jesus' disciples said, now you're speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. Right there at the end. Just slip it in right under the finish line. Do you now believe? Jesus replied, a time is coming, and in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each of you to your own home. You will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. I've told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. One of the setups in this statement is, it makes me think of Moses more than anything else. And I know when we think of the story of Moses, and I mean, he's kind of a big character in the first several books of the Bible, and he did some pretty incredible things, like helping to separate a Red Sea and leading an entire nation out of slavery and guiding people through a desert. But when it says in verse 25, though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use this kind of language. I'll speak plainly about my Father. And then they respond in 29, you're now speaking clearly. There's a moment in Numbers chapter 12 where Moses gets the biggest accolade that resonates Moses to me of all of them. And so if you're not familiar with this story, it's where Aaron and Miriam, who are also prophets, and they speak from God, they get really offended at Moses' choice of wife, and they want to rile people up about it and say, doesn't God speak to us too? And it's the most incredible, I need to turn to it actually. It's Moses to me, of all the things that exemplify him, it's this. And so Aaron and Miriam bring this forward to God, and God pulls them in. He calls them to a meeting. He comes down in a cloud, and he says, listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly, and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you afraid to speak against my servant Moses? He speaks to him clearly. And yet Jesus here is giving this same promise. At this moment in his ministry, the parables are done. And he's just going to tell them and speak to them clearly. And that same message is being received to us. And we have the entirety of the Bible and this scope of looking back and our hindsight being 2020 to realize that this message that we're getting is not something hidden. But we're getting a message from God the way Moses was presented with him. Not in a mystery, not in a vision or a riddle. But he speaks to us clearly. And of anything of Moses' incredible life, this statement from God is what hits me the most about who Moses is. That was a tangent. I have a lot to cover here. So that's the setting. Let's get into the text. So we're going to be looking John chapter 17, and we're just going to be looking really at these first 5 verses. So after Jesus said this, he looked toward heaven and prayed, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, so that your Son may glorify you. Let's pause right there and take a look at this. So after Jesus says these things, these distressing but encouraging and honestly kind of accusatory, that's probably not a word, accusations to these disciples, he takes this moment and he does 2 things. He looks up toward heaven and he prays. Now, the idea of looking up when you pray is less commonplace now, but very commonplace then, and kind of a sign of the way that you're approaching God. So if we look back in Luke in the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee and they're praying, the Pharisee does exactly what he shouldn't do and speaks and brags and says, I'm so happy that I'm not like these people. But the tax collector, he looks down. He won't even look up. And he beats his chest and he says, forgive me, I'm a sinner. But the way that you approach, the way that Jesus approaches this prayer is looking up, kind of resolute, I would say. He's approaching God with the idea of looking up. And then he says those first words, Father, the hour has come. And now we have done a past sermon, and I'm sure you can find it online, really looking at God as a father. But all of those adjectives that come consistent with the idea of God as a father absolutely apply here. Because, we can't look at God as a father and think of him as, you have to look at him as a father because there's so much more that encompasses in what that means. So if he was just a judge, he couldn't be loving and comforting. But if he was just comforting, he couldn't be fair. And so he's a comforter and a redeemer and a judge and, an all-powerful being, but he's all of those in one, which is what makes him a father. And so it's so key that he says, Father, right here. And the next statement is, my hour has come. And now, in the book of John, he spent a lot of time saying, it's not my time yet. He says, it's not my hour. It hasn't come. But he says it first in chapter 12, when he is riding into Jerusalem. So he is coming to his last week. He knows that all the work that he's been doing and all of the crafting of this carefully orchestrated ministry was put into place, and it's for this moment, this coming into Jerusalem. And he says, my hour has come, and he repeats it here. And it shows, to me, an authorship of his plan, because he knows what's what's going to happen. I do want to look quickly at John 12 when he first makes that statement. John 12 and verse 23. It says, Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant will also be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." I do like a good crime drama, I'm going to say. So I don't read for pleasure often. But when I do, I like these mystery books about like the detective who's also like the super detective. And so people like Steve Barry, and I do enjoy reading like Dan Brown. And the thing that these guys do as the author is they have a lot of stories. And they're like all separated and they're kind of close together, but they're also really not. And then as the story moves along, these separate stories that seem so unrelated start pulling together until that last moment when everything that was going on with everybody kind of culminates in this moment. And as the author, he knew the story, already before he wrote it, and how all these pieces would come together. But that's really the exact sort of thing that's happening here when Jesus knows that his hour has come. He's seen the period in history in which he showed up. He knew the political climate. He knew the religious climate. He knew the work that he needed to do, and that it would ultimately end right here. But the statement that he makes here in verse 27, my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. This statement, among almost any other, is one that resonates to emphasize the humanity of Jesus and the fact that he was 100% very really human. This word soul, my soul is troubled, we've actually seen this word come up a few times. In the Greek, it's the word suke. And now if that sounds familiar, it's also the word that often, about 50-50 split, gets translated life. And this is the aspect of you that is a living being that has conscious thought and, decides how you're going to go about your day-to-day. This is your life. And easily translated here, soul, it's also like the breath of life, so it's very a wind-focused sort of spirit idea. But humans have an innate desire to survive. So we want to not die necessarily. So there's something about us that says we'd like to carry on. And Jesus certainly here, and other people through history have been able to forcefully put that aside, to sacrifice their life. We see it in parents, we see it in soldiers, we see it, in some instances. So it's something that does get done sometimes. But the desire to not have to die is a very human characteristic. And Jesus here emphasizing, my soul is troubled, what shall I say? Should I put this aside? He says, no. You need to push down that human thought of saving yourself, because this story has culminated to this moment. And so when he repeats that again, not a week away from his death, but mere hours away, to say, my hour has come. It's a heavy moment of knowing the authorship of what you've brought yourself to. All right. So let's keep going in that prayer since I made it through the first verse. Doing great. Let's go ahead and read this in its entirety. After Jesus said this, he looked toward heaven and he prayed, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. For you granted him authority over all people, that he might give eternal life to all those you have given him. Now this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. I have brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began." There's a key term there. If you caught it, he said it a few times. Glorify. Have you ever wondered what that means? It's used a lot in the Bible. It's a very common word to apply. And it's something that in modern American English cultures, we don't use that word a lot. Around Christmas, we'll sing, I'm not going to do it, but glorious. We'll say it that way. It comes up some in religious areas, but it's not a term that comes up a lot. And so it brought me to the moment of saying, what is glory anyway? And it's quickly become one of my newly favorite translated words that we get. And we're going to take a little look why. So, first of all, so it says, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. Oh my goodness, could you imagine if a Pharisee heard Jesus say that? Would have lost their mind. If they weren't trying to kill him before, that is, for a human to say, Father, give me glory? The audacity. But he says it because he's God. So here's a couple of cool instances where glory comes up a lot. So in Psalm 19, it refers to the glory of God. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And so it's something that creation screams out about. It'll say something. But in Luke chapter 2, this is that really great Christmas scene where the shepherds are in the field and these angels kind of appear in a cloud, and the cloud is shining with the glory of God. And so the glory of God might be something that creation sings about, but it also might be something in creation itself as far as a cloud and showing the glory of God. But in Romans chapter 3, it says, all have fallen short of the glory of God. But in 1 Corinthians, we also get that we should do everything for the glory of God. And so it became a very weird concept for me to try and wrap my head around, and hopefully you're all equally as confused as I am. And so we're going to take a little look at what it means to have glory. So this is, you guys ever seen this one before? This is Mount Rushmore. Some of you probably drove by that today even, who knows. So if we look at Mount Rushmore, we have these couple of president heads, carved into a nice big mountainside for us. And someone might look at Mount Rushmore and see that and think about it and say, well, this is kind of, well, it's a memorial for those people, right? We could say, you look at this or any other statue and say, well, it kind of honors those people. And if you were writing in biblical times, you very likely would look at this and say, this is to their glory. So the actual word here, if we look back in the Hebrew, this word that gets translated glory, it has a couple of meanings, and we get it translated as glory in only some of them, but they're all very related. And the thing I love about this one is, so often we'll see some of these older words, and it really doesn't correlate to common English very well. This one totally did, and I loved it. So it's pronounced kavod. And what it really means is weight or heavy. So there's a story in 1 Samuel where classic Israelites getting in a fight, and they're battling with the Philistines, and they lose. And the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant, like Indiana Jones' Ark. They take it. And Eli is the priest at the time. And he's waiting to hear news of the battle, and someone runs in and tells them that the Ark has been taken. And it is distressing for him. And he falls off of his chair, and because he was old and had kavod, he broke his neck and died. So kavod is because he was old, and my Bible said heavy. So, I mean, normally you wouldn't fall off a chair and die, but if you're old and you have some brittle bones and you're very heavy, you very well could die from doing that. And he does, because he was kavod. So he was heavy. So in a very literal sense, it can mean weight. So something that's very heavy. But it can metaphorically mean something of importance. So you can have a heavy conversation with someone, right? You can look at the gravity of a situation. And so those also are ideas of kavod and glory and the importance of something. It can also mean wealth and possessions and things that are important to you. So Hezekiah, when he brought in the people to show them the vast splendor of, his storerooms and the shields and the wealth of the nation, he was displaying his kavod at that time. And so it's an idea of something being heavy and important, and also of what is important to you as well. And all of those ideas are wrapped up in the concept of what is glory. And so when it says, glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you. And then at the end, and now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that we had before the world. It's the everything that resonates off of you that is serious and important and valuable. And the essence of what makes you great are all those things that can be your glory. Honestly, if we think about this, there was one time, I didn't get to see it, President Trump at the time had come to Mount Rushmore, and I stayed home. But I remember at one time, like in my youth, I was visiting somewhere, and all of a sudden, like a line of cars started coming. There was like police cars galore. And then there was something that was still official, but not a police car. And it was a procession that was a mile long. It was huge. Shut down the roads. I was probably eating at a fancy Taco Bell. And it just passed. And then later on the news, I was like, what in the world was that about? It was a vice president just driving by. So, but they will shut it down when somebody important comes. But that whole procession leading up to the one car and the one all afterwards, we could say is to that vice president's glory. So that would be their glory passing by, as it would be. So all those things that are valuable and important. And the glory is really something that it's more representative of the value and the importance of who, in this case, who these people were in their time. And so it's a monument that is glorious to them, but resonates to the person behind what that memorial is about. And so when we look at chapter 12 and Jesus' perspective on what's going on, we really get to display his humanity. But here, verses 4 and 5, it says, I've brought you glory on earth by finishing the work you gave me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory I had with you before the world began. I don't think there's any statement that I've read that exemplifies the deity of Jesus more than this. And both of those instances and both of those facts are seen hugely, right? Not next to each other, but in reference to the fact that his hour has come. But here in the middle, he talks a bit about his eternal life. So for you granted me authority over all people, that he might give eternal life to all those you have given him. Now this is eternal life. So suke was that term life here, or life used before. This is back to zoe. This is the fullness and the ultimate complete expression of what a life could be. To the age is the idea, or eternally, forever, is kind of that concept. But he tells us, what is eternal life? It's to know God. And now, this idea, so that they know you, is a term that is much more than they know about you. It is very consistent with the idea of a intimate and personal relationship. So when Jesus was born, it emphasizes nicely for us that Joseph had not yet come to know Mary. There is an intimacy of that relationship, and that's what it means to have eternal life. And the thing that I love about that is that you can have that now. That's something that exists for us currently and onto forever. You don't have to lose it. But to be able to say that I know God, that I have a relationship with this person who came here, put aside the humanity that was built into him, and completed a work, is knowing God and giving you what is eternal life. And so God's plan and his work, in his authorship of that plan, in knowing the pieces that would come together and the actions that would ultimately have to take place, are things that he did so that his children can know him. And when you think about it, that's really what a father would do.